What if the man who would one day command the greatest military alliance in history was nearly destroyed by the very system he was trying to serve? Not by enemy fire, but by the invisible war of politics, power, and institutional pride that raged inside the corridors of Washington itself. The year was 1942, and the United States had just been dragged into the most devastating conflict the world had ever witnessed. Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of American invulnerability on December 7, 1941, and in the weeks that followed, the entire machinery of American government lurched into a frantic, desperate scramble to reorganize, rearm, and redefine who actually held authority over the millions of men being called to fight. At the center of this invisible storm stood two men whose visions for how a modern war should be fought were fundamentally, sometimes bitterly, at odds. One was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, a man of towering political genius who had guided the country through the Great Depression and who now considered himself not merely a head of state but a true commander-in-chief in every operational sense of the word. The other was Dwight David Eisenhower, then a relatively obscure brigadier general from Abilene, Kansas, a man whose brilliance had long been trapped beneath layers of military hierarchy but who had begun, quietly and methodically, to push back against a system he believed was heading toward catastrophe. Their clash was never loud, never public, and rarely recorded in the headlines of the day, yet it shaped the entire architecture of how America would fight, and ultimately win, the Second World War. The tension between them was not one of personal hatred or open confrontation, but something far more dangerous and far more instructive, a collision between political authority and professional military judgment, between presidential instinct and strategic expertise, between the need for control and the imperative of competence. Understanding this conflict means understanding something profound about power itself, about what happens when great men disagree about who should lead, and how much hangs in the balance when they do. If this story is already pulling you in, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. So please subscribe right now, hit the like button, share this video with a friend who loves real history, and leave a comment below telling us something you didn't know about Eisenhower before watching. Your engagement keeps this kind of deep, serious storytelling alive. When Eisenhower arrived in Washington in December 1941, summoned by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, he was not yet the iconic figure history would remember. He was 51 years old, had never commanded troops in combat, and had spent much of the previous years serving as a staff officer under men like General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. Marshall, a man of extraordinary discernment, had watched Eisenhower for years and recognized in him something rare, an ability to synthesize complex strategic problems, to understand logistics not as a bureaucratic function but as the very spine of military power, and to manage the enormous human friction that comes when multiple commanders, multiple nations, and multiple egos must somehow be made to operate as a single instrument of force. Marshall called him into his office at the War Department on December 14, 1941, just 1 week after Pearl Harbor, and presented him with a scenario. The Philippines were under assault, MacArthur was besieged, and American relief was almost certainly impossible. What should be done? Eisenhower asked for a few hours, retired to a quiet office, and returned with a memorandum that was clear, unsentimental, and strategically sound. He argued that the Philippines could not be saved in the short term, that resources must be concentrated in Australia as a base for future operations, and that the United States must resist the emotional impulse to throw good men after bad in a hopeless theater. It was the kind of cold, disciplined analysis that Marshall had been searching for, and within weeks Eisenhower was assigned to the War Plans Division, the nerve center of American strategic thinking. But even as his star began to rise inside the Pentagon, the environment around him was growing increasingly complicated, because Franklin Roosevelt was not simply a president who issued directives and stepped back. Roosevelt was a man who genuinely believed that his instincts, shaped by decades of political experience and an intimate knowledge of human nature, made him qualified to involve himself deeply in military operational decisions. And that belief would become the source of enormous tension in the months ahead. Roosevelt had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, and he carried from that experience an abiding confidence in his own military judgment. He had studied naval strategy, had visited the front lines in France in 1918, and had developed strong personal opinions about how wars should be fought, which commanders should be trusted, and which theaters deserved priority. By early 1942, he was meeting almost daily with his Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marshall, Admiral Ernest King, and General Henry Hap Arnold, and these meetings were often less consultations than presidential monologues interspersed with probing questions and firm conclusions. Roosevelt was drawn to bold, dramatic operations, to the idea that a single audacious stroke could transform the momentum of the war, and he was deeply skeptical of military professionals who, in his view, spent too much time explaining why things couldn't be done rather than finding ways to do them. This temperament led him to a fateful decision in early 1942 that would put him directly at odds with nearly every senior officer in the American military establishment. The British, under Winston Churchill, were pressing urgently for an Allied operation in North Africa, what would eventually become Operation Torch, arguing that this was the only realistic theater where American forces could engage the Germans in 1942 without risking catastrophic overextension. Marshall, and to a significant degree Eisenhower, believed the correct strategy was to build up forces in Britain for a massive cross-channel assault into France as quickly as possible, striking directly at the heart of German power and avoiding what they saw as peripheral adventures. Eisenhower, writing in his diary in the spring of 1942, called the potential diversion to North Africa a strategic mistake of potentially serious proportions, arguing that it would consume resources, delay the main effort in Europe, and give the Germans time to consolidate their positions. But Roosevelt had already made up his mind, and the nature of his authority as commander-in-chief meant that the professionals, however experienced, however analytically persuasive, would ultimately have to yield. The reorganization of the American military command structure in the early months of 1942 was itself a battlefield of a different kind, and Eisenhower found himself navigating it with the same meticulous care he would later bring to planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. The old pre-war army had been organized on a model that dispersed authority among numerous bureaus, chiefs, and semi-autonomous commands, a structure that had made sense in peacetime but was utterly inadequate for the demands of global war. General Marshall had been working since the late 1930s to modernize and streamline the system, and by March 1942 he pushed through a sweeping reorganization that created three major commands: Army Ground Forces under General Leslie McNair, Army Air Forces under General Arnold, and Army Service Forces under General Brehon Somervell, while consolidating strategic planning under the Operations Division, which Eisenhower would soon head. This reorganization was a significant victory for the professional military, a genuine step toward the kind of rational, centralized command structure that modern warfare required. But it also increased the concentration of authority at the top, and that meant that every major strategic decision now flowed either through Marshall or directly to Roosevelt himself. For Eisenhower, who was producing detailed strategic memoranda at a remarkable pace throughout the spring of 1942, this created a peculiar situation. His analyses were brilliant, his recommendations were carefully reasoned, and Marshall clearly trusted them. But the ultimate arbiter was a president who had his own vision, his own sources, his own instincts, and his own political calculations to consider. The British alliance was not merely a military matter. It was a political relationship that Roosevelt managed with enormous personal investment, and Churchill's eloquent, relentless advocacy for the Mediterranean strategy carried a weight with the president that no American general's memorandum could easily counterbalance. The question of who would command the planned Allied operations in Europe was itself a source of deep anxiety throughout 1942, and it illuminates much about the nature of the Roosevelt-Eisenhower dynamic. Roosevelt initially assumed that Marshall would take the supreme command, and Marshall himself was quietly expectant of this assignment. It would have been the capstone of a career dedicated entirely to the service of the United States Army. Eisenhower, for his part, expected to remain in Washington as a staff officer, supporting whoever received the operational command. But as the summer of 1942 progressed and the decision to proceed with Operation Torch became irreversible, Roosevelt overriding Marshall's objections in a direct confrontation in late July 1942, a new question emerged. Who would command this North African operation that the American military professionals had not wanted in the first place? The answer, emerging in early August 1942, was Eisenhower himself, who was appointed commander of the European Theater of Operations and then designated as Supreme Allied Commander for Torch. It was an extraordinary development, the appointment of a man who had never commanded in combat to lead the first major Allied offensive operation of the war. Marshall had recommended him, Roosevelt had approved him, and Churchill had accepted him, but the appointment carried with it an almost unbearable burden of expectation mixed with institutional ambivalence. Eisenhower was being handed a command that his own strategic analysis had argued against accepting, in a theater he had publicly, if privately, described as a diversion. He would have to execute with complete professional dedication an operation whose strategic wisdom he had questioned, and do so in a manner that satisfied not only his military superiors but a president who was watching every development with intense personal interest and who was not above intervening directly if the results disappointed him. The planning for Operation Torch through the late summer and fall of 1942 revealed with painful clarity just how complex the web of authority had become. Eisenhower was nominally the supreme commander, but his freedom of action was constantly circumscribed by political considerations that flowed directly from Roosevelt and Churchill's negotiations at the highest levels. The selection of landing sites, for example, whether to attack at Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, at Oran, or at Algiers, was not a purely military decision but a political one, shaped by concerns about French resistance, Spanish neutrality, and the range limitations of Allied air cover. Roosevelt involved himself directly in these deliberations, sometimes bypassing the military chain of command entirely to communicate with French officials whose cooperation he was seeking. General Mark Clark, Eisenhower's deputy, was dispatched on a secret submarine mission to North Africa in October 1942 to negotiate directly with French military commanders, a mission authorized at the presidential level that Eisenhower supported but which illustrated how thoroughly political and military considerations had become intertwined. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was dealing with the reality that the forces available to him were less experienced, less equipped, and less prepared than anyone had hoped. The American Army in 1942 was still in the early stages of transformation from a peacetime institution of fewer than 200,000 men to a wartime force that would eventually number over 8 million, and the units being assembled for Torch were green, incompletely trained, and equipped with weapons that had not been fully tested in the conditions they would face. Every week, Eisenhower filed detailed reports to Marshall and, through Marshall, to Roosevelt, and every week the pressure from Washington intensified as the political timetable that Roosevelt had committed to, the operation had to occur before the November 1942 midterm elections, compressed the time available for preparation. On November 8, 1942, Allied forces landed simultaneously at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers in Operation Torch, and the immediate military results were mixed in ways that immediately strained the relationship between Eisenhower and his Washington superiors. The French resistance at Casablanca was fiercer than anticipated, and American forces under General George S. Patton, commanding the Western Task Force, fought intense battles against Vichy French defenders for 3 days before a ceasefire was arranged. At Oran, resistance was also substantial, and at Algiers, British and American forces encountered a situation complicated by confused loyalties and shifting political allegiances among the French colonial administration. The political resolution that followed, the so-called Darla deal, in which Eisenhower's headquarters negotiated an arrangement with Admiral François Darla, a senior Vichy official who had collaborated with the Nazis, in exchange for French cooperation, created a political firestorm that burned directly back to Washington. Roosevelt was furious, not because the deal was strategically unsound. Darla's cooperation genuinely accelerated the Allied advance, but because it created an enormous public relations crisis, with critics on both sides of the Atlantic accusing the United States of legitimizing a fascist collaborator. Eisenhower found himself in the extraordinary position of defending a decision that had been made in the field under genuine operational pressure, against a wave of criticism that threatened to end his command before it had fairly begun. Roosevelt issued a carefully worded public statement on November 17, 1942, describing the Darla arrangement as a temporary expedient, and privately expressed his displeasure to Marshall, a displeasure that Marshall, with characteristic loyalty, absorbed rather than transmitted directly to Eisenhower. The episode illustrated something fundamental. In the new architecture of Allied command, the supreme commander in the field was not truly supreme. He was an executor of policy, and policy was made in Washington and London, by men who were accountable to publics and parliaments and who would not hesitate to apply pressure when the political consequences of military decisions became uncomfortable. We are now at the heart of this story, at the exact midpoint of a conflict that changed not just who won the Second World War but how America would organize its military power for generations to come, and if you have stayed with this narrative, you understand something important about how real history works. Please subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already, give this video a like, share it with someone who thinks they know the full story of World War II, and comment below telling us what part of this behind-the-scenes struggle surprised you most. The hidden architecture of power is always more fascinating than the official version. The winter of 1942 and into 1943 brought Eisenhower face-to-face with the most acute crisis of his early command, one that once again exposed the fault lines between presidential authority and field judgment. The Tunisian campaign, which followed the Torch landings, was going badly. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim had responded to the Allied landings with characteristic speed and aggression, rushing reinforcements through Tunisia and establishing a defensive perimeter that the inexperienced American forces struggled to penetrate. On February 19, 1943, at the Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia, German armor tore through American defensive positions in a catastrophic engagement that resulted in nearly 10,000 American casualties and a retreat of nearly 80 kilometers, the worst defeat in American arms since the opening months of the Civil War. The shock in Washington was profound. Roosevelt, who had staked enormous political capital on the North African operation, demanded explanations. Marshall relayed the president's concerns to Eisenhower with his characteristic directness. Eisenhower, who had already recognized the problems that led to Kasserine, inadequate training, poor coordination between American and British units, insufficient anti-tank doctrine, moved quickly to address them, relieving the commander of 2 Corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and replacing him with Patton, whose aggressive, driving style he believed could restore the fighting spirit of the American forces. But the episode forced Eisenhower to confront a reality that he had perhaps underweight in his pre-war staff work: the human dimension of command, the fact that strategic soundness means nothing without the ability to forge disparate human organizations into a coherent fighting instrument, and that this is itself a form of genius quite different from the ability to write a brilliant memorandum. The relationship between Eisenhower and Roosevelt began to shift subtly but perceptibly through the Tunisian campaign and into the planning for what would follow. Roosevelt had been skeptical of Eisenhower's fitness for supreme command. He was, after all, an unknown quantity who had never led men in battle, but the recovery after Kasserine, the eventual Allied victory in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, when over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in the largest Allied victory of the war to that point, demonstrated something that political calculation alone could not produce. Eisenhower had learned, adapted, and delivered. Meanwhile, the larger strategic argument continued, with Marshall and Eisenhower still pressing for the cross-channel operation, now designated Operation Overlord, while Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff continued to advocate for further operations in the Mediterranean. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to an invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, as the next step after Tunisia, and at the Trident Conference in Washington in May 1943, a date of May 1, 1944 was set for Overlord. Eisenhower, now commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, was deeply engaged in planning Husky and the subsequent invasion of mainland Italy, but his eye was always on the larger prize, the cross-channel assault that he believed would be decisive. He wrote to Marshall repeatedly through 1943 expressing his conviction that the Mediterranean operations, while valuable, must not be allowed to consume the resources that Overlord would require, and Marshall shared these concerns and carried them directly to Roosevelt. The president, characteristically, listened to all sides, weighed the political dimensions alongside the military ones, and made decisions that were sometimes more Churchillian than his American generals preferred. But he was also, unmistakably, moving toward the confrontation with German power in France that the American military establishment had always believed was necessary. The question of who would command Overlord became one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the entire war, and it was resolved in a way that illustrated with elegant clarity both the nature of Roosevelt's authority and the complexity of his relationship with his military subordinates. Throughout the second half of 1943, it was almost universally assumed that Marshall would receive the Overlord command. It was the supreme command, the climax of the Allied effort, and Marshall had earned it by any reasonable measure of service and ability. Churchill supported Marshall. Stalin expressed confidence in him at the Tehran Conference in November and December 1943, and Marshall himself, with characteristic self-discipline, neither sought the position nor declined it, leaving the decision entirely to the president. Roosevelt was torn. He needed Marshall in Washington, the Army Chief of Staff's managerial genius, his relationships with Congress, his ability to navigate the bureaucratic complexities of global war supply and mobilization were irreplaceable. As Roosevelt told Marshall with characteristic frankness in December 1943, he could not sleep at night with Marshall out of Washington. The decision was made. Marshall would remain as Chief of Staff, and Eisenhower, who had commanded the only significant Allied offensive operations of the war, who had demonstrated the ability to manage a genuinely multinational coalition, and who had shown the resilience to recover from serious reverses, would command Overlord. It was a decision that surprised many, that disappointed Marshall, and that placed Eisenhower in a position of responsibility so enormous that its full weight must have been almost physically crushing. He received the news at the Tehran Conference in early December 1943, and later recalled that when Roosevelt told him personally, the president seemed almost to be seeking reassurance rather than giving a directive, as if, having made his decision, he needed Eisenhower to confirm that the trust was not misplaced. The months between December 1943 and June 1944 were the period in which the Roosevelt-Eisenhower dynamic reached its most mature form, a relationship no longer characterized primarily by tension and uncertainty but by something more complex, a mutual recognition of what each man could and could not do, and a grudging acceptance of the boundaries between political authority and military expertise. Eisenhower, now at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London, threw himself into the planning of Overlord with an intensity that consumed him entirely. He clashed repeatedly with Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and General Karl Spaatz over the air campaign, specifically over whether Allied strategic bombers should be used to attack German oil infrastructure or French transportation networks in advance of the invasion, a debate that had genuine strategic significance and that eventually came to Roosevelt himself for resolution. He managed the enormous complexities of the coalition with British commanders like Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose abrasive personality and conviction of his own superior strategic judgment created friction that never entirely dissipated. He dealt with the Patton slapping incident, in which Patton struck a hospitalized soldier in Sicily, in a way that saved a brilliant but reckless commander for later use while absorbing enormous political pressure to dismiss him. Throughout all of this, Eisenhower maintained a channel of communication to Marshall and through Marshall to Roosevelt that was notable for its candor. He did not tell Washington what it wanted to hear, but what he genuinely believed, and this quality of honesty, which had cost some officers their careers, seems to have reinforced rather than undermined Roosevelt's confidence in him. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces crossed the English Channel in the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare. More than 156,000 troops landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day alone, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and over 11,000 aircraft. The planning that made this possible represented the accumulated wisdom of 3 years of war, including all the lessons of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, including all the arguments about strategy and command and the proper relationship between political authority and military expertise. Roosevelt followed events from Washington with intense anxiety, making public statements and private prayers, and when the initial reports indicated that the landings had been successful, the relief in the White House was almost physical in its intensity. Eisenhower, who had written a note accepting full personal responsibility for the operation's failure in case it went wrong, destroyed that note when success became clear, though the text of it survived and has since become one of the most poignant documents of the war. The success of Overlord did not resolve all the tensions in the Allied command structure. Arguments about the proper strategy for the campaign across France, about whether to pursue a broad front or narrow front advance into Germany, would continue until the final weeks of the war, but it established beyond any reasonable doubt that Eisenhower's judgment, the judgment that had sometimes clashed quietly but persistently with Roosevelt's political instincts, had been fundamentally sound. The peripheral operations in the Mediterranean had bought time, had trained American forces, and had contributed to the eventual outcome, but the decisive blow had been struck exactly where Marshall and Eisenhower had argued from the beginning it must be struck, directly across the Channel, into the heart of German-occupied France. Franklin Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war he had done so much to shape. He died at Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, less than a month before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. He died with a victory he had worked toward for years almost within reach, and among the last things he knew about the war was that it was being won, that Eisenhower's forces had crossed the Rhine, that the Soviet armies were closing on Berlin from the east, and that the extraordinary machinery of Allied power that he and Marshall and Eisenhower and so many others had built, argued over, adjusted, and fought with was delivering the result they had all, in their different ways, believed it could. The clash between Roosevelt and Eisenhower over military control was never simple, never entirely resolved, and never the kind of open confrontation that makes for easy drama. It was instead the productive friction between two kinds of authority, two kinds of intelligence, and two kinds of responsibility, and out of that friction came something neither man could have produced alone. Eisenhower had learned from Roosevelt that war is never merely a military problem, that political dimensions shape and constrain every strategic decision, and that the supreme commander who ignores this reality is not a pure professional but a dangerous innocent. Roosevelt had learned from Eisenhower, and from Marshall, that the professional's expertise demanded genuine respect, that there were limits to what political instinct could substitute for military judgment, and that the best use of his authority as commander-in-chief was not to override the professionals but to set the conditions in which their best qualities could flourish. If this story has moved you, challenged your assumptions, or shown you something about history and power that you didn't see before, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Please subscribe if you haven't already, like this video to help others find it, share it with someone who deserves to know this hidden history, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most or what you had never known before about Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and the invisible war they fought together.